Welcome. Learning Science Goes Online is a series of short videos in which we analyze key findings from the education research literature and then connect those to the practice of designing and teaching online courses. In this video, we'll be looking at studies that compare online learning outcomes with face-to-face learning outcomes. The key question we want to address in this video is which is more effective, online learning or face-to-face learning? And you hear so much about this in your day-to-day life that I think it is worth actually looking at the data that we can bring to bear on this question to see what the differences may be. The study that we're going to delve into here is actually a study of many different studies, a meta-analysis. And what that means is that the authors had specific criteria and went looking for studies that met those criteria and then screened them very carefully to see whether or not they could be included in the study. So ultimately, 28 different studies were included in this meta-analysis, and they were comparing fully online learning versus face-to-face learning. So typically this means that the students were learning the same subject, but one group was learning online and another group was learning in a face-to-face setting. And learning had to be the outcome measured in these studies. So that means that some objective measurement of learning, either a quiz or a test or a final grade in the course, was used for the basis of comparison. And very critically, the authors didn't include perceptions of learning in this meta-analysis. So they didn't include studies in which the investigators asked students how they felt they were learning. Because the research on learning shows that our perceptions of our own learning are often very different than what's actually happening objectively. The things that we like and the things that we think are causing good learning aren't necessarily the same as those things that are causing learning. That said, this study does have a number of limitations. First of all, it was conducted in 2009, so there are many more studies since that time that have come out that could affect the findings. Secondly, it's a little bit limited by the number of K-12 studies that are included in the data set. There just weren't that many studies on K-12 online versus face-to-face teaching at this time. So while there are some studies in the meta-analysis, there are more studies that focus on higher education. And then finally, this doesn't cover all the different fields of study. There were more studies from the health sciences and computer science than other fields. Before we can actually dive into the data, we need to learn a little bit about effect sizes. Effect sizes are a way to standardize and compare very different studies using two different statistics, the mean and the standard deviation. So in this case, the mean is going to be the mean score on that measurement of learning. And the way that this is calculated is the mean online minus the mean in the face-to-face setting, with all of that divided by the standard deviation. So to make this concrete, if we hypothetically have an effect size of +1, that means that on average in the online course, students scored one standard deviation higher than those in the face-to-face course. So now we can look at the data. In this plot, we're looking at effect sizes, and those are plotted on the y-axis. And then on the x-axis, we can see each of the studies represented as a point with lines. The point is the effect size, and the line running through it is the 95% confidence interval. So each of these points represents a different study. We can see here that most of the points fall above 0, which means that there's more learning happening in the online setting. But some of the points also fall below 0, which means that there's more learning happening in the face-to-face setting. And critically, on average, the effect size was 0.05, meaning that the students in the online setting were learning a little bit more than the students in the face-to-face setting. But overall, this isn't a huge difference. So really the conclusion is that online and face-to-face learning are having similar amounts of learning outcomes at the end of these studies. So that brings us to recommendations based upon the findings of this study. And the recommendations this time are presented as a poem. Keep an open mind, blended may be best, design for online, and you'll get the rest. Really the key point here is to keep an open mind. You may hear a lot of terrible things about online learning, but the research suggests that it's at least possible to achieve equivalent learning outcomes in an online setting. Blended may be best. What this means is that blended learning, which is a mix of face-to-face and online learning, may actually have slightly better learning outcomes than either online or face-to-face. This was also investigated in the meta-analysis, but I didn't present the data. So if you do have an opportunity to use blended learning approaches, I'd recommend it. If you don't, and you have to teach fully online, I'd recommend convening with your students using video conferences just to keep a social connection with your students and engage them. Design for online. The The study showed that those courses that were adapted for online use tended to have slightly higher positive effect sizes than those courses that weren't adapted for online use. And this makes sense. If you're actually planning to use the affordances of technology to teach, you're probably going to have better learning outcomes. And finally, you'll get the rest. Just like learning anything else, as you practice this, you'll become more comfortable, and eventually teaching online will feel natural. Thanks for watching. You're free to reuse this video for internal training in your school, but please do not reuse it for any commercial purposes.